In the heart of a forgotten city, where time itself seems to stand still, lies a story that has remained buried for decades. A place once full of life, now frozen in tragedy and mystery. Pripyat, where the disaster of Chernobyl ignited a dark legacy, and where untold secrets still echo in the abandoned streets. What if the truth about what happened here is far darker than we've ever been told? What if the disaster was just the beginning? Step into the shadows of this forsaken land, where time bends, secrets unravel, and a force far beyond our understanding lingers, waiting to be discovered. Are you ready to uncover the truth? Because the story of Pripyat isn't over, it's just beginning. And what you're about to hear may change everything you thought you knew. Stay with us. The truth is more terrifying than you can imagine. In the heart of Ukraine, hidden from the world, lies a city where time itself has stopped. Pripyat, a place now silenced by a devastating event, once thrived under the shadow of the Soviet Union, a thriving symbol of the future. But that future was never meant to be. And now, decades later, the city stands as a ghost, frozen in time, as though caught in an eternal pause. Pripyat wasn't always a place of death and decay. Before the Chernobyl disaster, it was a beacon of Soviet ambition, a symbol of progress. The city was young, just over a decade old, founded in 1970 to house the workers and their families who would operate the nearby nuclear power plant. It was a place of hope and optimism, a place where life was designed to be bright, modern, and full of potential. It was, in many ways, a utopia, a place where everything was in its place. But even in this city of bright futures, shadows lingered. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, Pripyat was alive with energy. Young families strolled down wide boulevards. Laughing children raced down clean streets. And the air was filled with the sounds of construction, building not just a city, but a dream. The houses were pristine, the streets were spotless, and the parks were filled with playgrounds where children's voices echoed in the summer air. There was a sense of purpose in the air. Everyone knew their place. Everyone had their role in the grand machinery of the Soviet state. The city had its own hospital, its own shops, its own theaters and schools, all carefully designed to cater to every need. Life, it seemed, was a carefully constructed illusion of perfection. There was even a small amusement park planned, complete with a Ferris wheel, awaiting its day of grand opening. But in the midst of this prosperity, an eerie sense of unease hung in the air, unnoticed by the busy citizens. No one could have known that beneath this city's perfect facade, a storm was silently gathering. There was a hum to the air that went unnoticed by the people of Pripyat, a hum not of life, but of something darker, something that wouldn't be heard until it was far too late. In the year 1986, as the city flourished, the world watched, oblivious, as the nuclear plant just beyond the city walls operated under the surface of an ever-growing tension. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was at the center of Pripyat's prosperity. It was a symbol of Soviet strength, modernity, and technological prowess. And yet, behind the towering reactors, something was wrong. There were murmurs, whispers, that the plant was being pushed to its limits, that the workers were taking risks, that something wasn't quite right. The government, as always, kept the details quiet. In this world, questions were not welcome. Life in Pripyat continued without interruption. The workers and their families went about their daily routines, unaware of the growing danger. But there were those who sensed it, the ones who couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting to erupt. They could hear it in the way the workers talked about the plant, in the stories of stress and exhaustion, in the sense that something dark hung in the air, unnoticed by the masses but felt by a select few. It was in this environment, one of quiet tension and ever-present unease, that the first rumblings of catastrophe began. But no one saw it coming. No one could have imagined that in the dead of night, a test would take place that would unravel everything. It would be an ordinary evening for the residents of Pripyat, just another cool April night, when the quiet hum of the city would be replaced by something far worse. A loud, violent, an unnatural roar that no one could have foreseen. The evacuation wasn't immediate. No sirens wailed. No one screamed in panic. Instead, there was an odd calmness, as if everyone was caught in a trance. The news came slowly, like a rumor passed quietly from one ear to another. The first hint of danger was a mysterious crackling in the air, something that could not be explained. The streets were eerily still. The citizens didn't yet know the scale of the disaster unfolding just beyond their city walls, but they could feel something was off. The smell in the air was strange, something metallic, like a storm that would never come. By morning, everything had changed. The nearby city of Chernobyl was in chaos, its workers racing to escape the toxic aftermath of the explosion at reactor number 4. But Pripyat remained eerily silent. People went about their routines, as if they hadn't heard the warning bells that should have been ringing. Perhaps it was a deep-seated denial, a belief that this city, built with so much promise and ambition, could never be touched by anything so catastrophic. After all, the people of Pripyat trusted the government, they trusted their leaders, and they trusted the technology that had been promised to make their lives better. They didn't know that their faith would soon be tested in ways they could never imagine. It wasn't until later in the day that the true horror began to unfold. The government, slow to react, issued orders to evacuate. But it was already too late. The toxic cloud of radioactive fallout had begun to settle over the city like a suffocating fog. What was once a thriving city now stood as a lifeless shell, its vibrant streets and parks soon to become the haunted remnants of a forgotten past. In the days that followed, the people of Pripyat began to leave their homes, walking quietly, almost mechanically, away from the place that had once been their paradise. The streets were empty, the homes abandoned. The laughter of children had vanished, replaced by the eerie silence of a city that would never see life again. Pripyat became a place suspended in time, a city that had once been filled with hope, now attuned to a broken promise. The amusement park, once a symbol of happiness, remained untouched, its rusted rides forever waiting for a grand opening that would never come. The Ferris wheel stood still, its empty cars swaying in the wind, a sad monument to the lives that had been lost. But what happened in Pripyat was just the beginning. The disaster would go on to shape the world in ways no one could predict. It would spark international outcry and reshape the way nuclear power was viewed forever. And it would leave behind a legacy of mystery, a mystery that continues to haunt the world today. Even now, decades after the event, Pripyat remains a forbidden land. Its empty streets and decaying buildings are a chilling reminder of the price of progress, a warning of what can happen when ambition and hubris collide. The question remains, how did it all come to this? Was it truly an accident, or was there something more, something darker, lurking in the shadows of this abandoned city? As the last of the citizens left, as the doors were sealed and the city was shut off from the world, one thing remained certain. The silence in Pripyat spoke louder than anything else. It was a silence born of fear, of uncertainty, and of something far worse, something that had been set in motion long before that fateful night. The storm was coming, and no one knew what would happen next. The first rumblings of an unexplained catastrophe had begun, and as the dust settled over the once thriving city, the world would never be the same again. But what caused it? Was it the power of nature? Was it an accident? Or was there something much more sinister at play? What if one split second could change the fate of an entire city? What if that moment, that tiny, invisible fraction of time, could turn an ordinary evening into a nightmare so terrible that it would echo through the ages? What if that moment was caused by human error or something far darker? The night was like any other in Pripyat. The streets were empty, save for the occasional straggle of late-night workers returning home from the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant, their faces weary, their bodies heavy from a long shift. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves in a dance that only the quiet of night could orchestrate. Above, the stars glistened cold and indifferent. It was as though the city itself was holding its breath, its once thriving streets now eerily silent, almost frozen in time. In the distance, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant stood like a dark sentinel, its towering reactors pulsating with energy, producing electricity for millions. The plant's workers, proud of their role in the Soviet dream, went about their business under the glow of the industrial lights. But behind those walls, beneath the hum of machinery, something was terribly wrong. That night, April 25th, 1986, was to be the night of a routine safety test, one that would alter the course of history and devastate an entire region. The engineers were tasked with testing the reactor's ability to handle a drop in power supply, a routine procedure that had been done countless times before. It seemed like a simple task, a piece of the puzzle in the grand machinery of the Chernobyl plant's operations. But what no one knew, what no one could foresee, was that this test, this seemingly inconsequential procedure, would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the greatest nuclear disasters the world has ever known. At the heart of it all was reactor number 4. The engineers and technicians in charge of the reactor were in a race against time. The test had been delayed multiple times, and now they were under pressure to complete it as quickly as possible. But as the hours passed and the clock ticked down, the workers became more and more desperate to finish the test, to get the results that would satisfy their superiors. Little did they know, they were about to make a decision that would forever alter the course of history. One of the most dangerous aspects of reactor number 4 was its design. The reactor was an RBMK type, a powerful and efficient reactor, but one with significant flaws. The very features that made it useful also made it unstable. The engineers working that night had no idea how unstable it truly was. The design flaws, combined with a lack of training, poor communication, and overconfidence, led to a catastrophic series of miscalculations. As the test began, the reactor's power output was intentionally lowered. But the lower the output, the more unstable the reactor became. In an attempt to stabilize things, the technicians began to make adjustments to the reactor's control rods, the very instruments that were supposed to keep the core under control. The decision to disable the safety systems, made under pressure with the clock ticking, was the first fatal mistake of the night. It was a moment of human error, one that would have far-reaching consequences. The reactor's core began to heat up uncontrollably. In an instant, the warning lights began flashing, bright, blaring signals of an impending disaster. But by the time the engineers realized the severity of the situation, it was already too late. The reactor was on the verge of a meltdown, and there was nothing that could be done to stop it. At 1:23 a.m., the explosion ripped through reactor number 4. The force of the blast was unimaginable. It sent a shock wave through the plant, shaking the ground beneath it, rattling the city of Pripyat miles away. The explosion tore through the reactor building, blowing off the heavy steel roof, sending radioactive debris into the atmosphere like a violent storm. A fire erupted and smoke billowed into the sky, carrying the deadly radioactive cloud with it. It was the beginning of the end, the moment when everything changed. But in Pripyat, just a few kilometers away, the city was blissfully unaware. The people went about their routines, living their lives in the shadows of a catastrophe they couldn't even imagine. The night remained calm, the city's silence unbroken. The workers at the plant, those who had survived the explosion, were in shock, bloodied, burned, and disoriented. But even in their panic, they had no idea how much danger they were truly in. The radioactive cloud was already spreading, drifting over Pripyat like a silent killer, invisible, insidious. The first hints of a disaster began to reach the authorities in the early morning hours. The sounds of the explosion had been heard in the distance, but no one knew exactly what had happened. The fire still raged at the plant, but reports from the scene were disjointed, conflicting. The Soviet government, in its typical manner, downplayed the situation, focusing instead on damage control and maintaining secrecy. They kept the details of the disaster under wraps, unwilling to admit the true scale of the catastrophe. As the day wore on, the wind shifted, carrying the radioactive cloud further and further from the plant. The people of Pripyat, oblivious to the danger above them, went about their day. The schools were open. The markets bustled. Children played in the streets. Life seemed normal, but all around them, the invisible poison was falling, slowly, silently, over everything they held dear. It wasn't until the early afternoon that the first signs of something being wrong began to appear. The wind, once gentle, began to shift, growing stronger. The skies turned an unnatural shade of yellow, a sickly, radioactive hue that seemed to hang over the city like a warning. The citizens of Pripyat were still unaware, still untouched by the horror unfolding just a few kilometers away. But the reality of the situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. By the time the government made the decision to evacuate the city, it was already too late. The radioactive cloud had settled over Pripyat, poisoning the air, the water, and the earth itself. But even as the authorities scrambled to react, there was no immediate action. No sirens blared. No warnings were issued. The citizens, still in the dark, carried on with their lives, unaware of the deadly cloud hanging above them. The true magnitude of the disaster was becoming clearer by the hour. The radiation levels were skyrocketing. The plant workers, who had been exposed to lethal doses of radiation, began to collapse from the effects. The heat from the explosion had ignited fires, and the radioactive smoke continued to pour into the atmosphere, spreading across the region. It was a silent apocalypse, a tragedy unfolding with every passing moment. The decision to evacuate Pripyat was made in the early afternoon, but by then, it was almost too late. Thousands of people were already exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. It was a race against time to get the city's residents out before the radiation would claim their lives. But even as the evacuation began, there was an unsettling calm in the air. The city, once alive with the noise of everyday life, now stood still. The streets emptied, the homes were abandoned, and the memories of a once thriving city were swallowed by the deadly grip of the disaster. As the last of the citizens of Pripyat left their homes behind, they could never have imagined what had just happened, what they had just escaped. They would carry the scars of that moment with them for the rest of their lives. For Pripyat, the city that once stood as a symbol of Soviet strength and hope, there would be no return. The explosion had shattered the illusion of safety, and the deadly cloud that spread over the city would leave an indelible mark on the world's conscience. But even as the last of the people fled, even as the city became a ghost town, there was still one question left unanswered. How many had already been exposed to the poison? How many were still trapped, unknowingly sealed in the radioactive grip of a disaster they couldn't comprehend? The city's fate had been sealed in a moment, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Pripyat would never be the same again, and neither would the world. As the city lay abandoned, the ghostly silence that had once hung over the streets now seemed to speak louder than ever. The disaster had only just begun, and the full extent of its horrors would not be known for many years. But the first rumblings of that catastrophe had already begun, and the city, now forever marked by the invisible poison, would never be safe again. In moments of crisis, we often find courage we never knew we had. But what happens when that courage isn't enough? What happens when the storm we thought we could weather turns into something far darker, more overwhelming, and more dangerous than we ever imagined? On the morning of April 27th, 1986, a sense of disbelief settled over Pripyat. The city, once filled with the sounds of laughter and bustling streets, now seemed eerily still. The explosion at the nearby Chernobyl power plant had shaken the foundations of reality, and yet the residents of Pripyat had only just begun to understand the full scope of the disaster that had unfolded. A radioactive cloud, invisible to the eye but deadly to every living being, had slowly begun to blanket the city. The air, the water, the very ground they walked upon, all poisoned. The government had finally issued the order to evacuate, but there was a problem. The people of Pripyat were reluctant to leave. The terror of the unknown held them in its grip. They had spent their lives building this city, investing their hopes and dreams into a place that represented the future. It was a symbol of progress, of safety, of a better tomorrow. And now they were being told to leave it behind. What kind of future would they face? What lay beyond the city's walls? For many, the fear of the unknown was far greater than the fear of radiation. The decision to evacuate came not with the blare of sirens, but with a quiet, authoritative announcement over the radio. It was businesslike, almost clinical. Pripyat must be evacuated. Please leave your homes and make your way to the buses. Do not return until further notice. The words hung in the air, as if the announcement itself was still trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. For a moment, it seemed as though no one truly believed it. After all, they had been living their lives in the shadow of the power plant for years. They had grown accustomed to the hum of the reactors, to the knowledge that they were part of something powerful, something important. How could that power turn on them? It wasn't long before the first signs of panic began to surface. People packed hurriedly, uncertain of what to take and what to leave behind. For some, it was business as usual. They grabbed a few belongings and set out for the buses, their minds already focused on what they would do once they arrived at the temporary shelter. But for others, the realization was slow to come. Their homes, the places where they had raised their families, where their children had learned to walk, to laugh, to grow, these places were being ripped from them. What did it mean to leave behind your life, to abandon everything you knew, and to step into the unknown? The decision to evacuate wasn't one made lightly. Families hesitated, clung to their homes, their memories, their routines. In a way, it was easier to ignore the looming threat, to convince themselves that the evacuation was just a precaution, that everything would be fine. Surely, it couldn't be that bad. But deep down, they knew the truth. The city was being poisoned, and time was running out. The government's evacuation plan was slow, methodical, almost mechanical in its approach. It was as though they couldn't bring themselves to admit just how dire the situation had become. The buses arrived one by one, filling up with families, but there were those who didn't get on. They stayed behind, clinging to what they knew, unwilling to leave behind the lives they had built. How could they leave their homes, their jobs, their neighbors? In their hearts, they believed they would return, that this would all be over in a few days, that the city would be safe again. But the truth was far more painful. As the hours passed, more and more residents of Pripyat left the city behind, walking down empty streets, carrying whatever belongings they could carry with them. The bus rides were silent. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. They were leaving behind not just their homes, but their entire way of life, the dreams they had built, the community they had nurtured for over a decade. The city, once filled with laughter and life, was being emptied one bus at a time. The journey out of Pripyat was unsettling. There was no sense of relief, no sense of safety. There was only the growing realization that the city, their city, was now a place of danger, a place of death. They were leaving the only life they had ever known, stepping into a future that seemed uncertain at best and terrifying at worst. The evacuation wasn't a simple departure. It was the end of an era. But the fallout of Chernobyl wasn't just a physical one. It was emotional. It tore families apart. It shattered the sense of security and stability that had been built over years of hard work. There was no guarantee that the residents would ever return to their homes, that their beloved city would ever be the same. The truth, though unspoken, hung over the entire evacuation. Some of these people would never see their homes again. As the buses rolled through the city's empty streets, one by one, the realization set in: Pripyat, as they knew it, was gone. The city was no longer just a place of danger. It had become a symbol of the fragility of life itself, a reminder of how quickly everything can change, how quickly the foundation of our world can crumble. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, there was a strange sense of detachment. The people of Pripyat moved through their city, packing their belongings, saying goodbye to neighbors, and leaving behind the homes that had once been filled with love and laughter. But it was as if they couldn't truly grasp what was happening. The trauma of it all was too great to process in the moment. It was too overwhelming. Some simply walked away in silence. Others clung to each other, their eyes filled with the unspoken question: where would they go now? What happened next? But the true horror lay not in the physical abandonment of the city, but in what they were leaving behind: a life, a community, a history. It wasn't just the buildings that were being abandoned. It was the soul of Pripyat, the friendships, the bonds, the routines that had shaped the lives of everyone who had ever lived there. These were the things that could never be replaced. As the last of the citizens boarded the buses, the city was left behind, empty and desolate. The streets, once bustling with life, now echoed only with the sound of the wind, carrying with it the invisible poison that would soon contaminate everything in its path. The empty playground stood as haunting reminders of what had been lost. The amusement park, with its rusty rides and abandoned Ferris wheel, remained frozen in time, waiting for an opening that would never come. In those final moments, as Pripyat emptied out, a question lingered in the air. Would the city ever be the same again? Could it ever be restored to its former glory? Would those who had left, those who had been forced to abandon their homes, ever be able to return to the life they had once known? The evacuation had been a necessary step, but it was also a cruel one. It marked the end of a chapter, the closing of a book that would never be opened again. The city of Pripyat, once a shining example of the Soviet dream, was now a ghost town, a place that would be forever haunted by the memories of those who had called it home. And as the last bus pulled away, carrying the residents to an uncertain future, there was one last, haunting realization. It wasn't just the city that was being abandoned. It was a whole way of life. The innocence, the hope, the sense of safety, all of it had been shattered in a single, violent moment. The people of Pripyat were not just leaving a city. They were leaving a world that would never be the same again. As the buses disappeared into the distance, the city of Pripyat was left behind, empty and forgotten. But the ghosts of its past, the memories of its people, would live on, haunting the landscape long after the radiation had faded. The story of Pripyat was far from over. It had only just begun. What happens when a city is abandoned overnight? When everything is left behind, untouched by time? What remains when the hum of life ceases, leaving only the silent echoes of the past? And what secrets lie hidden in the decaying walls, in the forgotten corners of a place that once teemed with activity? Pripyat was never meant to be abandoned. It was meant to grow, to thrive, to become a testament to Soviet ambition, a perfect symbol of the future. But that future was ripped away in an instant, and the city was left behind, frozen in time like a snapshot of a life that never had the chance to fully unfold. In the days that followed the disaster, Pripyat slowly transformed from a bustling metropolis to a ghost town. The streets, once filled with the chatter of children, the laughter of families, and the bustle of workers, became eerily silent. No longer did the voices of the living fill the air, but the heavy silence of the abandoned began to take hold. It was as if the city had been swallowed whole by an invisible force, leaving behind only the remnants of a life that had been. The most chilling aspect of Pripyat's abandonment was its stillness. It wasn't the silence of an empty space. It was the silence of a place waiting to be filled again, as if the people had just stepped out for a moment and would return at any time. The evidence of their lives, their routines, was still there, scattered throughout the city, untouched, undisturbed. In the classrooms, the desks were still arranged in neat rows, the blackboards still filled with faded lessons from a time long gone. In one classroom, a child's toy lay abandoned in the middle of the floor, a plastic car left in mid-drift as though it had been dropped in the middle of a game. The toy's colors, once vibrant, had now dulled with age and dust, but its presence was still a ghostly reminder of the lives that had once filled this place. Every corner of the room seemed to hold a memory, an imprint of the past that had been left behind in the chaos of evacuation. In the school cafeteria, the long tables sat empty, but the plates and trays were still there, half filled with food that had been left untouched. The food had begun to rot, its smell long gone, but the evidence of the hasty departure was clear. It was as though the children, the teachers, the workers had all stepped away from their lives without a second thought, unaware that they would never return. The smell of the cafeteria's food, once so familiar, so comforting, was now replaced with the musty scent of decay, of time slowly eroding everything it touched. As you walk through the empty halls of Pripyat, the sense of abandonment grows stronger with each step. In the apartments, the personal belongings of the city's residents remained where they had been left. Clothes hanging in closets, books lying open on tables, photographs resting on the surfaces of furniture. These were the small, intimate details of everyday life, now frozen in place, as though the residents had just stepped away for a moment. The beds were still made, the shoes still lined up neatly by the door, and yet no one would ever come to sleep in those beds again. No one would ever walk through those doors again. In one apartment, a family photo sat on a coffee table. The frame cracked, the faces of the family members smiling out from the picture. The photo was as fresh as the day it had been taken. Yet the lives of the people in it had been interrupted by an invisible force, their smiles frozen in a moment of time that could never be relived. No one would ever come to dust the frame, to wipe away the years of grime that had built up on the glass. The family was gone, their lives interrupted by something so violent, so incomprehensible, that it left only their memories behind. And then there were the eerie details, the little things that seemed to whisper the story of Pripyat's abandoned state. A forgotten umbrella resting against the doorway, a half-empty glass of water on a desk, a television left on, its screen blank and static, the last image frozen in place, as though it had been abandoned in the middle of a program. These things, these tiny fragments of normalcy, were now strange, unsettling reminders of a world that no longer existed. There was a psychological toll to the abandonment that went beyond the physical remnants of Pripyat. It was the knowledge that the city, once so full of life, had become a silent monument to a disaster. The residents hadn't just left their homes, they had left everything behind. They had abandoned their routines, their places of comfort, their sense of safety. It wasn't just the city that had been evacuated, it was their very sense of identity, their sense of belonging. The psychological weight of this abandonment hung heavy in the air. The air itself seemed to be different in Pripyat. It was thick with the sense of waiting, as though the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The windows, once clear and bright, now stood grimy and cracked, allowing only a faint, muted light to filter into the rooms. The streets outside were eerily empty, the wind carrying with it the faint scent of decay, of a place slowly being reclaimed by time. Yet, even in the desolation, there was a strange beauty to the city's stillness. The decaying buildings, the rusted playgrounds, the overgrown streets, they all held a story. They were part of the greater narrative of Pripyat, a city that had been both a dream and a nightmare, a place of hope and a place of despair. The contrast between the life that had once been and the death that had come to claim it was striking. The broken windows and peeling paint told a story of abandonment, but they also told a story of a life that had once been lived here, a life full of memories, full of hopes, and now full of ghosts. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea that the residents of Pripyat had left behind their homes, their lives, without ever realizing the full extent of what had happened. They had been evacuated, yes, but they had been sent away without knowing the full truth about what had caused the disaster, without knowing how it would affect them, their children, their future. In the days following the explosion, as the city was emptied, there was no sense of finality, no sense that the residents had truly said goodbye. It was as though the city itself had been frozen in place, waiting for its inhabitants to return and pick up where they had left off. But that return would never come. The lingering question in the minds of those who dared to venture into Pripyat's decaying remains was simple yet profound. What secrets was the city hiding in its empty buildings, in its deserted streets, in the walls that had witnessed the downfall of an entire community? Was the city simply a symbol of a tragic disaster, or was there more to its story? More that had been hidden, locked away, buried beneath layers of dust and radiation? What had really happened here? And what had been lost in the chaos of that terrible night? As the decay of Pripyat continues to claim the city, the mystery deepens. The abandoned buildings stand as silent witnesses to a past that can never be fully understood, and the city, frozen in time, holds its secrets close. The people of Pripyat may be gone, but their story is far from over. The city still whispers, still calls to those brave enough to seek its truth. What does it feel like to know you're being poisoned, and yet you can't see it? How do you fight an enemy you can't touch, hear, or smell? This is the terrifying truth faced by those living in the shadow of Chernobyl. The invisible, silent killer that hovered over the abandoned city and its people was unlike any threat they had encountered before. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't an invasion, and it wasn't something that could be fought off with weapons or strength. It was radiation, an invisible force that seeped into every corner, every crevice, every molecule of the land, and of those who stay behind. As the people of Pripyat fled in the wake of the explosion, the fallout didn't just dissipate with the wind, it lingered. It swirled through the air, seeped into the soil, and soaked into the very buildings they had left behind. For the people who had remained, there was no escape from it. Radiation, once released into the atmosphere, becomes an all-encompassing, invisible presence. Its effects can only be felt over time. The terror wasn't immediate. It was slow, creeping into their bodies, destroying them from within without them even knowing it was happening. For those who lived through the initial disaster and chose to stay, the days that followed were filled with confusion, uncertainty, and a growing sense of dread. They were told that it was safe, that the danger had passed, that they could go on with their lives as though nothing had happened. They were told that everything was fine, yet deep down they knew something was wrong. A subtle fear gripped their hearts, but there was no immediate, tangible threat to confirm their suspicions. They couldn't see the poison that surrounded them. It was a force beyond comprehension, an enemy that didn't fight back, didn't scream, didn't demand attention, yet it was present in every moment, in every breath. The first signs of the invisible enemy's presence were subtle. People who had been exposed to radiation began to feel a strange fatigue, a deep weariness that didn't make sense. At first, it was dismissed as shock or the aftereffects of a disaster, but as days turned into weeks, the exhaustion became more intense. The heaviness of the body was accompanied by nausea, headaches, and a strange metallic taste in the mouth. It was as if their bodies were rejecting something, but they didn't know what it was. There were no physical injuries, no wounds to tend to, no visible signs of damage. But something was wrong. The radiation was in their bloodstreams, creeping silently into their organs, altering their DNA at a microscopic level. It was a death that didn't announce itself. It simply arrived in the form of sickness, a slow unraveling of life. There were those who tried to continue with their daily routines, who went to work, attended to their families, and tried to keep life as normal as possible. But the city of Pripyat, once a model of Soviet pride, had become a prison. People went about their days in a fog, unaware that every moment spent in the city was a moment that further weakened them. Their bodies were being attacked by something they couldn't even perceive. It was like walking through a poison-laced fog, unable to see it, but feeling the effects slowly suffocate them. As the weeks passed, the reality of the situation became clearer. The survivors began to notice that many of their friends and family members were falling ill, suffering from mysterious illnesses that seemed to defy explanation. Children, in particular, seemed to be the most vulnerable. Their immune systems, still developing, were no match for the toxic environment that had taken hold of Pripyat. They developed strange rashes, swelling, and bleeding. Their hair began to fall out, their skin turned pale and sallow, and many were struck by severe fatigue. It was a tragedy unfolding in slow motion, a disaster that wasn't immediately visible but was destroying them nonetheless. Yet, even as this invisible enemy took hold of their bodies, there was a strange sense of helplessness. The people of Pripyat could do nothing to fight back. They couldn't see the radiation, couldn't touch it or hear it or taste it. It was like a ghost, always present, always lurking, but never showing itself. How do you fight something you can't even identify? How do you defend yourself against a force that doesn't announce itself, doesn't make its presence known except through the slow, torturous unraveling of your health? And then there were the landscapes, the forests, the fields, the rivers that had once been vibrant, full of life, now silent and barren. The wildlife was equally affected. Birds fell from the sky, their feathers burned by the radiation, while animals in the area developed tumors and deformities. The trees, once green and lush, began to wither and die, their leaves turning an unnatural yellow. The river that had once flowed peacefully through the city now ran thick with contamination, a deadly poison that spread across the land like a silent tide, creeping into every corner of the earth, touching everything it could. What had once been a thriving ecosystem had become a lifeless, contaminated wasteland. The land itself had been poisoned by an invisible force, and no one knew when or if it would ever be restored. As the radiation began to take its toll, the authorities started to release information. Though they were careful with the truth, hiding the worst of it from the public for fear of panic. But it was too late for some. The damage had already been done, and many of those who had stayed behind would suffer the consequences for the rest of their lives. Their bodies were already marked. The radiation was already inside them, altering their very cells, their very DNA. It was a ticking time bomb, but no one knew exactly when it would go off, how long they had before the full extent of the damage would be revealed. Survivors of Pripyat have spoken of the strange, almost surreal sense of being watched, of knowing something was wrong but being unable to fully grasp it. There was a sense that the environment itself was alive, aware of them, quietly watching their every move. There were whispers of strange occurrences, unexplained sounds in the distance, a sense of dizziness that seemed to come from nowhere, headaches that would strike with no warning. It was as if the very air they breathed had become toxic, and they were left powerless to stop it. The invisible enemy was everywhere. It was in the air, in the water, in the food they ate. There was no place to run, no place to hide. It had taken root in the very fabric of their existence. Then came the hospital visits, the long, tiring trips to the makeshift medical centers that were set up for those who had been exposed. But even the doctors seemed uncertain, unsure of how to treat the invisible wounds that were being inflicted on their patients. The treatments were mostly experimental, and many of the doctors were themselves struggling with the same effects of radiation exposure. There was no cure, no antidote to the poison that had entered their bodies. And so, they waited, not knowing what would happen next, whether they would survive, whether they would be the lucky ones, or whether they too would fall prey to the invisible enemy. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors spoke of an overwhelming sense of grief, loss, and betrayal. They had been abandoned by their own government, left to fight a battle against an unseen force that they couldn't even fully comprehend. There was guilt too. Guilt for not leaving sooner, guilt for not understanding the severity of the situation, guilt for staying in a city that had once been their home but had now become a death trap. Many survivors would carry this guilt with them for the rest of their lives. The question that lingered over everyone who had been touched by Chernobyl's invisible enemy was simple. How many had been affected by something invisible yet deadly? How many had been exposed, unknowingly, to the poison that had seeped into every aspect of their lives? How many had been marked for death before they even knew it? It wasn't just the survivors of Pripyat who would bear the scars of Chernobyl. It was the land, the animals, and the generations to come. The effects of radiation would echo across time, leaving behind a legacy that would never fade. And the invisible enemy, though silent, still lingers, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it will reveal its full and devastating power. What happens to a place when it's abandoned for decades? Does it retain the memories of those who once lived there? Or do those memories slowly fade into the earth, swallowed by time and decay? Some say that when a city like Pripyat is left behind, it carries with it the echoes of the past, the ghosts of those who lived there, their voices, their laughter, their hopes. And some say the memories never truly leave. They linger, hanging in the air like a mist, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to venture into the shadows of what once was. Pripyat had been abandoned for years, decades, even, but that didn't mean it was truly gone. It was a place frozen in time, its streets still echoing with the remnants of life once lived. It was no longer the city that people once knew. It had become something else, something far more unsettling. The silence in its streets was heavy, suffocating. The wind whispered through the broken windows of the high-rise apartments, and the rusted playgrounds, abandoned since the day of the evacuation, creaked eerily in the wind. The amusement park, so full of promise in the years before the disaster, stood still, its Ferris wheel never to turn again. It wasn't long before the curious began to return. They were explorers, scientists, thrill seekers, people drawn to the abandoned city by the mystery that hung in the air, by the stories of its past, by the danger it still held. The Chernobyl exclusion zone had become a forbidden land, a place where few dared to tread, but those who did weren't afraid of the unknown. They were drawn by a deep need to understand the past, to uncover the secrets buried within the city's crumbling walls. Some of them believed that the past had left its mark on Pripyat, its souls lingering, unwilling to leave. They believed the city was haunted by its own memories, and it was easy to see why. After all, Pripyat had been a symbol of Soviet ambition, a shining example of progress, until that fateful night when everything changed. In an instant, it became a graveyard for dreams, a place where life had been interrupted by an invisible force. The ghosts of Pripyat weren't just the souls of the people who had lived there. They were the very essence of the city itself, trapped in its decaying buildings, waiting to be heard. As explorers stepped back into the radioactive zone, they were immediately struck by the strange atmosphere. It wasn't just the eeriness of the empty streets or the haunting silence that unnerved them. It was the sense that something was watching, waiting, following them. Some said it was the wind, the creaking of the old buildings shifting under the weight of time. Others said it was the ghosts, whispers of the dead, echoes of the past. And some, unable to explain it, simply called it the oppression of the place, a sense of foreboding that grew stronger with every step they took. They found strange phenomena, odd lights flickering in abandoned classrooms, faint shadows moving just out of view, and voices that seemed to carry on the wind, barely audible, as if someone was calling from far away. The sounds were always just on the edge of hearing, never clear, never direct, but always there like a haunting presence. They would stop, listen, and for a moment, it felt like they weren't alone in the ruins of Pripyat. It felt as though the city had come alive again, if only for a fleeting moment. In the schools, they found desks still in neat rows, books left open as though the children had just stepped out for recess, never to return. In the hospitals, the beds were empty, but the smell of antiseptic still lingered in the air, as if the doctors and nurses had just stepped out of the room. The city was still filled with the echoes of its past, the quiet whispers of the lives that had once filled these spaces. The explorers could feel it, the weight of it all. It was as if Pripyat, with its long history of ambition, hope, and eventual destruction, had become a vessel for the memories of all those who had ever lived there. But there was more to the city than just memories. The deeper they ventured into the heart of Pripyat, the stranger things became. One group of explorers, while traversing the upper floors of an apartment block, swore they saw strange lights flicker in the windows, lights that couldn't possibly be explained by anything natural. It wasn't a power surge, they insisted. There was no electricity left in the city. Yet, as they passed by the window, the light flickered again, casting a pale glow over the desolate street below. Was it the last remnants of energy, or was there something else at play? They ventured deeper into the zone, into the places most others dared not go. The places where the radiation was still dangerously high, where the air seemed to thicken with every breath. And in these places, the phenomena grew stronger. They began to hear strange sounds, footsteps echoing in the distance, the creak of floorboards beneath weight, the soft rustling of paper in an empty room. At times, it felt like they were walking through a house abandoned long ago, a house that still held the traces of its former occupants. dust on the furniture, faint impressions in the carpet where someone had once stood. It was as if the ghosts of Pripyat had left their mark on every inch of the city. But it wasn't just the strange sounds or the flickering lights that unsettled the explorers. It was the feeling that they weren't just walking through a city frozen in time. They were walking through something far older, far more profound. Some said the city had been built upon ancient land, perhaps even atop something far older than the Soviet project. There were rumors, whispers of buried secrets, of something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The more they explored, the more they found scraps of old documents, photographs, and letters that seemed to tell a different story of Pripyat. They found symbols carved into walls, strange markings on the floors, and objects that seemed to have no explanation. Some suggested it was the work of the original inhabitants, those who had lived in the area long before Pripyat became a Soviet experiment. Could the city have been built upon sacred ground, a place where ancient rituals had once taken place? Had the spirits of the past been disturbed by the modern-day plans for the city, leaving behind these strange signs? One group of explorers made their way into the heart of the power plant itself, where the explosion had taken place. They discovered a room, long forgotten, sealed away behind a rusted door. The room was untouched, its contents still as they had been left decades ago. But something was wrong. They noticed it immediately. The temperature in the room had dropped. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the once faded documents in the room seemed fresh, as if someone had just placed them there. They picked up a piece of paper, and it was covered with strange markings, symbols they couldn't decipher, yet they felt strangely familiar. Some said it was radiation playing tricks on their minds, but others whispered that they had found something far darker. Was the room a place where something ancient had been hidden? Or was it something more sinister, a place that had been sealed away for a reason? The deeper the explorers went, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The unease in the air thickened, and some began to question whether the city was simply haunted by its past, or something much more sinister had taken root in Pripyat's long-abandoned halls. Were the ghosts of the people who had once lived there trapped, unable to move on, or was there something more, something waiting to be uncovered, something that had been buried beneath the radioactive soil all along? And then, the discovery, one that would change everything. As they moved through the decaying hospital, one of the explorers stumbled upon an old, weathered journal hidden beneath a floorboard. It was written in a language they didn't recognize, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. But as they flipped through the pages, something caught their eye, a symbol drawn again and again, over and over. It was the same symbol they had seen carved into the walls of the power plant, and it seemed to pulse with a strange energy as though it was alive. The explorers couldn't explain it. They had uncovered something ancient, something that should never have been disturbed. And as the journal's final entry loomed before them, they realized with a chilling certainty, some secrets are meant to stay buried. And now, they had awoken something that would never allow them to leave. Some places are born from tragedy, and in Pripyat, tragedy has left behind questions that no one can answer. A city once filled with hope, promise, and ambition now lies in ruin, frozen in time by a disaster that shattered its people, its future, and the very fabric of the Soviet dream. But while the catastrophe itself is well known, it is the mysteries surrounding it, the unanswered questions that linger long after the smoke of the explosion has settled. Pripyat, abandoned for decades, has become a place of legend, a city that holds more secrets than answers. Since the day the world turned its back on the city, stories have circulated of strange markings, unexplained phenomena, and inexplicable events that defy explanation. Some say the city is haunted by its past, its spirits unable to move on. Others whisper of a cover-up, of dark secrets hidden by the very government that once promised safety to its people. And among the few brave enough to return to the radioactive zone, the mysteries only seem to deepen. It was no longer just the city of Pripyat that intrigued those who ventured back. It was the questions that lingered in the air, unanswered and unresolved. As they explored the abandoned buildings, the explorers found themselves coming face to face with the inexplicable. Strange markings etched into walls and floors that seemed to have no logical explanation. Symbols and signs that didn't belong to the Soviet era, left behind by someone or something else. The markings appeared in places that made no sense, in areas that had been untouched by human hands for years. And yet there they were, as fresh and vibrant as the day they had been carved. Some of these symbols resembled ancient runes, strange, looping designs that seemed to pulse with an energy that the explorers couldn't explain. Others were more geometric, almost industrial in nature, but their meaning remained elusive. Could they be the work of those who had once lived in the area? Or was there something more? Something that reached back further in time, beyond the city's history, perhaps even beyond human understanding? And there were the artifacts, objects that seemed out of place, scattered across the city. An old, rusted key, lying abandoned on the floor of a forgotten office building. A tattered diary, its pages yellowed and curling, its words barely legible, but its presence undeniable. Who had left these items behind? And why? What secrets did they hold? Each artifact found raised more questions than answers, leaving the explorers with a sense of unease that grew stronger with each step they took. But it wasn't just the physical remnants of the city that held an unsettling power. It was the atmosphere itself. The feeling that Pripyat, though empty, wasn't quite empty at all. The air seemed thick, heavy, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. And the deeper the explorers ventured into the city, the more the strange occurrences began to multiply. The flicker of lights that didn't exist, shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't, the sense of being watched, even when no one was there. One group of explorers ventured into a high-rise building that had been abandoned since the evacuation. As they made their way up the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, they noticed something strange. The windows, which should have been covered in dust, were perfectly clean. It was as if someone had wiped them down recently, yet they were alone in the building. At the top of the stairs, they found something even more unsettling. A door that had been sealed shut for years, its lock broken, its hinges rusted. But it had been opened recently. Who had been here before them? And why? Inside the room, the explorers discovered a set of strange markings etched into the walls, symbols that seemed to be arranged in a pattern that was anything but random. The patterns were unlike anything they had seen before, almost ritualistic in nature. But the most disturbing discovery came when they found a strange object tucked away in the corner. It was a small metallic sphere, no bigger than a baseball, but its surface was smooth, unnaturally so. It hummed with a faint energy, a vibration that seemed to reverberate through the air. No one knew what it was or where it had come from, but the sense of unease in the room was palpable. Could this be a remnant of something far older, far more dangerous than they had ever imagined? As the explorers continued their search, they began to piece together a story that didn't make sense. The symbols, the markings, the strange artifacts, they seemed to point to something hidden, something intentionally buried. Some of the more daring theorists began to speculate that the explosion at Chernobyl might not have been an accident after all. What if it was something far darker, something planned by forces far beyond the reach of the ordinary citizen? Was it possible that the disaster was merely a cover-up for something much more sinister? Rumors had long swirled around the Chernobyl disaster. Whispers of secret Soviet experiments, of a government willing to sacrifice its own people for the sake of power and progress. But in the years following the disaster, the truth remained hidden, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. No one really knew what had happened at the plant, and those who had tried to uncover the truth had met with resistance at every turn. The official narrative, the one the Soviet Union had put forward, was that the disaster had been caused by human error, a mistake in the handling of the reactor. But even those who were closest to the disaster had their doubts. What if the explosion had been part of a larger plan? What if the Chernobyl disaster wasn't just a result of technical failure, but a deliberate act, one that had been orchestrated by those in power? Could it be that Pripyat, and the people who lived there were merely pawns in a game played by forces far beyond their understanding? Were the strange markings, the unexplained artifacts, the whispers of the dead, all part of a larger conspiracy, one that had been carefully hidden for decades? As the tension mounted, some of the explorers began to fear that they were getting too close to the truth. They felt it in their bones, the sense that they were uncovering something that was meant to remain buried. It wasn't just the radiation that threatened them now. It was the knowledge that they had begun to peel back the layers of a mystery that had been shrouded in secrecy for too long. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that what had happened in Pripyat wasn't just a disaster. It was the tip of the iceberg. And then came the discovery, a clue that would change everything. Hidden in the abandoned archives of the Chernobyl plant, a group of scientists uncovered a set of documents that had been sealed away for decades. The papers were worn, the ink faded, but the words were clear. They spoke of experiments, dangerous experiments, being conducted in secret under the guise of nuclear research. But there was more. The documents alluded to a hidden agenda, one that involved not just nuclear power, but something far more arcane, something that bordered on the supernatural. Was it possible that the disaster at Chernobyl had been caused by forces beyond the realm of science? By something ancient, something forbidden? The scientists who had found the documents couldn't explain it. They didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. Pripyat and the Chernobyl disaster were linked to something far darker than they had ever imagined. And the more they investigated, the more they realized that the answers they were seeking might not just be buried in the past. They might be waiting, hidden beneath the very ground they walked on. The mystery of Pripyat was far from over. And as the explorers and scientists continued to dig deeper, they uncovered even more secrets, secrets that could change everything. What had happened in Pripyat wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just the result of human error. There was something darker at play here. Something far beyond anything they had ever imagined. And as they uncovered the truth, the question lingered in the air. Could they ever escape the consequences of what they had uncovered? Or had they, too, become part of the very mystery they were trying to solve? When the veil of time is lifted, ancient whispers tell stories of forbidden knowledge and lost power. What secrets did Pripyat once hold? Hidden beneath its foundations, buried deep in its history. The city, so full of life in the days before the disaster, now stands as a monument to what was lost, a place frozen in time, abandoned, and yet still alive with the weight of its untold past. As the dust settles over its decaying buildings, it becomes clear the story of Pripyat is far older, far darker, and far more mysterious than anyone could have imagined. The city of Pripyat was created for one purpose: to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was meant to be a model city, a shining example of Soviet ambition, built to accommodate the workers who would operate the nuclear reactors that powered the region. The residents of Pripyat were proud of their city, proud of the work they did, and proud of the future they were helping to build. But what if Pripyat wasn't just a modern creation? What if the land on which it stood had been chosen for reasons far beyond the ambitions of Soviet planners? As researchers and explorers began to probe the forgotten corners of Pripyat, strange and unsettling clues began to emerge. There were whispers, rumors passed from one person to the next, that the city had been built on ancient land. Some said that the location of Pripyat had been chosen because of its proximity to sacred sites, old ruins, and forgotten relics. Could it be that the land itself held a power, a dark history that had been deliberately overlooked by those who had built the city? Was Pripyat cursed by the very ground it stood on? The more they searched, the more they uncovered. Some believed that the location of Pripyat had long been inhabited, that ancient civilizations once flourished in this region before being wiped out, lost to the sands of time. The idea that Pripyat could have been built on top of an ancient site was not entirely far-fetched. Across the region, archaeologists had discovered ruins, old stone foundations, buried artifacts, and strange markings that suggested a long history of human settlement. But what had happened to these ancient cultures? Why were they wiped from the records? And what had they known or discovered that led to their downfall? One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came from a forgotten chamber deep within the city. While exploring the abandoned school, a group of investigators stumbled upon a hidden door tucked away behind a crumbling bookshelf. Inside the room, they found a collection of ancient-looking manuscripts covered in dust and sealed shut with a thick layer of grime. The papers were old, too old to have come from the Soviet era, and their contents were even more disturbing. The pages were filled with strange symbols, glyphs that had never been seen before, and references to things beyond the comprehension of the average person. One of the explorers, an experienced historian, recognized some of the symbols from ancient cultures that had vanished from the world long before Pripyat was ever conceived. The markings resembled those used by early pagan tribes, whose knowledge of the natural world had been steeped in ritual and mystery. But what caught their attention most was a single phrase, written in a language that no one could decipher completely. It spoke of something hidden beneath the earth, something ancient, something powerful. The text alluded to a force, a primal energy that lay dormant beneath the city, waiting to be awakened. As the explorers delved deeper into the mystery, they uncovered more pieces of the puzzle. It seemed that Pripyat's location was not a mere coincidence, but rather the culmination of something much older. They discovered evidence suggesting that the Soviet government had known about these ancient sites and had purposefully chosen to build the city on top of them. Some researchers speculated that the Soviets were attempting to tap into this ancient power, harnessing it for their own purposes, perhaps even using it to fuel their nuclear ambitions. But there was no clear answer. The evidence was fragmentary at best, and many of the documents they found were too damaged or too incomplete to fully understand. Yet, there was something undeniable about the connection between the land of Pripyat and the ancient past. The city, built on these forgotten ruins, had been destined for disaster from the beginning. The very foundation of the city had been touched by forces beyond the grasp of its creators. Was this why the Chernobyl disaster had been so catastrophic? Had the power beneath Pripyat's soil awakened something it was never meant to? Flashbacks to pre-Chernobyl Pripyat paint a picture of a vibrant, bustling city, a place where people lived, worked, and raised families, with no hint of the darkness that would soon consume it. Yet, as more is uncovered, it becomes clear that the city's modern history is not as clean as it first appeared. Even before the disaster, strange occurrences had been reported. People spoke of inexplicable feelings of unease, of strange dreams and visions, of whispers in the night that couldn't be explained. Were these simply the effects of a growing industrial city? Or had the ancient forces beneath the surface begun to stir, reacting to the nuclear power that had been unleashed nearby? Some of the old legends surrounding Pripyat speak of a time when the city was not a modern marvel, but a place of mystical significance. It was said that in the ancient past, long before the Soviets arrived, the region had been home to powerful shamans, wise men who could harness the natural energies of the earth. These figures were believed to have a deep connection with the land and the forces that flowed beneath it. But with the rise of civilization, these practices were driven underground and the knowledge was lost. Or so they thought. As the mystery deepens, it becomes clear that Pripyat may have been built not only on the site of ancient ruins, but on top of something far more significant, a source of power that was not meant to be disturbed. Was the nuclear disaster merely the result of a technical failure, or had something far darker been at play? Some researchers believe that the explosion at Chernobyl was not an accident, but rather the unintended consequence of disturbing forces that had lain dormant for centuries. Perhaps the power beneath Pripyat soil had reacted violently to the manipulation of nuclear energy, triggering the explosion that would forever change the city and the world. But there is one final piece of evidence that has left many researchers and explorers questioning everything they thought they knew. Deep within the radioactive ruins of the Chernobyl power plant, a group of scientists discovered something so strange, so utterly inexplicable, that it has left them baffled and shaken. It was a relic, an object hidden away in the deepest recesses of the planet's control room, one that seemed to defy explanation. The object was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Its shape was unfamiliar, and its material was unlike any known to science. It seemed to hum with an energy of its own, a strange, pulsating vibration that sent chills down the spine of anyone who touched it. The object was quickly removed from the site and analyzed in secret, but its origins remain unknown. Some believe it is connected to the ancient forces beneath Pripyat, a key to unlocking the mysteries of the past. Others fear it is something more dangerous, a conduit to a power that no human should ever control. What is the true history of Pripyat? What secrets does it hold beneath its crumbling streets and decaying buildings? And what happens when the forces of the past collide with the ambitions of the present? As the search for answers continues, one thing is certain. Pripyat's story is far from over. It is a place of mystery, of forgotten knowledge, and of power that is yet to be fully understood. And as the truth begins to surface, the chilling question remains. Was the disaster at Chernobyl truly an accident? Or was it something far more deliberate? A dark force awakened by human hands, set in motion long before the first reactor went online? The answers may be buried deep within the ruins of Pripyat. And the further we go, the more we uncover, the more we realize some secrets are never meant to be revealed. What if the true reason for the Chernobyl disaster was hidden from the world? What if the truth is far darker than we've been told? What if the devastation, the radioactive cloud that swept over Pripyat and the surrounding regions, was not the tragic result of human error, but part of a far more secretive, carefully orchestrated plan? Could there have been a hidden agenda behind the catastrophic explosion that altered the course of history? Chernobyl, the name alone evokes a sense of catastrophe, of destruction, of the lives torn apart by a disaster that continues to shape the world. But as we dig deeper into the story of what really happened in 1986, we begin to uncover a web of conspiracy, a tale of hidden experiments, government cover-ups, and manipulation on a scale that would shake the very foundations of our understanding of the disaster. The official story, the one we were all taught, was simple. A human error at reactor number 4, coupled with design flaws in the RBMK reactor, caused the explosion. The event was an accident, and the aftermath was a tragedy that could have been avoided if the proper safety measures had been followed. But what if the explosion wasn't an accident? What if it had been set in motion deliberately? What if the Chernobyl disaster was the result of something far more sinister? Rumors and conspiracy theories have swirled around Chernobyl for decades. Some suggest that the disaster was a test gone wrong, a secret Soviet experiment designed to push the limits of nuclear power. Others claim that the explosion was a deliberate act, part of a larger plan to cover up something far more dangerous. The question remains, why? Why would the Soviet government, or any government, purposefully allow such a disaster to unfold? As we begin to piece together the story, the theories become more disturbing. Evidence suggests that Chernobyl may have been used as a testing ground for new forms of nuclear energy, not for power generation, but for something else entirely. Some theorists believe that the explosion was caused by secret experiments conducted behind closed doors, hidden from the public eye. Experiments that involved the manipulation of the nuclear reactor in ways never intended for power production, but for purposes that remain shrouded in secrecy. One of the most compelling theories involves the idea that the Chernobyl disaster was a test of a new, more powerful nuclear technology, one that had the potential to change the course of warfare. Could the Soviet Union have been testing a nuclear weapon under the guise of a peaceful energy project? The explosion at Chernobyl, if it were indeed a result of a secret experiment, could have been a way for the Soviets to test the effects of a new type of radiation, one that could be used for strategic purposes. But the story doesn't end there. If we look beyond the realm of nuclear experimentation, we begin to see a pattern emerge, one that suggests that Chernobyl was not just an isolated event, but part of a much larger, more dangerous plan. The explosion could have been a calculated move to cover up the existence of something far darker, something that the Soviet government was desperate to keep hidden from the world. There are whispers of a secret project, one that existed in the shadows of the Soviet government for decades. This project, known only to a select few, involved the development of a new type of energy, one that was not based on nuclear fusion or fission, but on a different, more mysterious force. The project was shrouded in secrecy, and its true purpose remained a closely guarded secret. Some say it was an attempt to harness the power of the mind, using nuclear energy in combination with psychological manipulation to create a new kind of weapon. Others believe that it was an experiment in time manipulation, an attempt to control the fabric of reality itself. What if the Chernobyl disaster was merely the tip of the iceberg, a smokescreen designed to divert attention from the true purpose of the Soviet project? What if the explosion at reactor number 4 was a carefully crafted diversion, meant to conceal the true nature of the experiment and keep the world from discovering the terrifying truth? As the theories grow darker, we find ourselves asking, could it be possible that Chernobyl wasn't just an accident? Could it be that the explosion was part of a larger agenda, one that was hidden from the world in order to manipulate the masses and keep the true power behind the disaster a secret? The tension rises as we dig deeper into the records and uncover more evidence. A collection of classified documents, previously thought to be lost, begins to surface. These documents contain information that paints a very different picture of the disaster than what we've been told. They suggest that the Soviet government was involved in experiments far beyond nuclear power, experiments that were designed to push the boundaries of human knowledge and control. One document, in particular, stands out, a report detailing an incident that occurred shortly before the Chernobyl explosion. The report describes a series of tests conducted on reactor number 4, tests that were not part of the standard procedures for the reactor. These tests, it turns out, were designed to simulate a catastrophic failure, pushing the reactor to its limits in order to measure the effects of a new type of energy. But something went horribly wrong. The report suggests that the explosion was the result of an unexpected reaction, one that was not caused by a simple malfunction, but by the unintended activation of a force that had been hidden deep within the reactor. The document also hints at a cover-up, suggesting that the Soviet government knew about the dangers of the experiment, but chose to proceed anyway. It paints a picture of a government that was willing to risk the lives of its people in order to keep the true nature of the experiment hidden. The document reveals that the explosion at Chernobyl was not a mistake. It was the result of a deliberate choice, a decision made by those in power to push forward with an experiment that had the potential to change the world forever. But the most chilling part of the document is the final entry, a cryptic note that suggests the true purpose of the experiment was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The note alludes to a force, something ancient, something that could not be controlled. It hints at a power beyond human comprehension, one that had been awakened in the reactor's core. The note ends with a warning. The experiment has begun. The consequences are beyond our understanding. The implications of this discovery are staggering. Could it be that the explosion at Chernobyl was not just the result of a failed experiment, but the opening of a doorway to something far darker? Could the true nature of the disaster be far beyond anything the world has been told? As the evidence mounts, the conspiracy theories grow more plausible. The idea that the Chernobyl disaster was part of a larger, more secretive plan is no longer a mere speculation. The documents, the reports, and the strange events surrounding the explosion all point to a truth that may never be fully revealed. Was the disaster truly an accident, or was it part of a much darker agenda? And if so, what was the true purpose behind the Chernobyl explosion? What was the Soviet government really trying to achieve? As we dig deeper into the mystery of Chernobyl, we realize that the truth may never come to light. Some secrets are too dangerous to uncover, too powerful to expose. And the more we learn, the more we realize some truths are meant to remain hidden, buried beneath the weight of time and the power of those who seek to control them. The mystery of Chernobyl is far from over. The whispers of the past continue to haunt the ruins of Pripyat, and the answers we seek may never be fully revealed. But one thing is certain: the truth is out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. Some places should never be entered. Some doors should remain closed. But when the truth calls, can you ignore its pull? The heart of Pripyat, once a thriving city, now a lifeless shell, was the site of one of the greatest disasters the world has ever known. It's a place where the echoes of the past linger in the air, a place where the land itself has been marked by an invisible, deadly force. It is a place that should not be entered, but there are those who cannot resist the call of the forbidden. In the years since the Chernobyl disaster, the exclusion zone has remained off-limits, a vast, radioactive wasteland that has become the subject of countless myths and rumors. Yet, there are those who still venture into the heart of the zone, driven by curiosity, by the desire for answers, or simply by the lure of the unknown. The dangers of the radiation, the decay of the once thriving city, and the weight of history itself have not deterred them. Instead, they have only made the heart of Pripyat more enticing. It was in the dead of night when a small group of explorers set foot into the heart of the exclusion zone. They were equipped with Geiger counters, protective suits, and cameras, ready to document the remnants of a disaster that had forever altered the course of history. But even as they made their way into the city, a sense of unease began to settle over them. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the silence was suffocating. There was no wind, no birds, no sounds of life, just the hum of the radioactive environment faintly buzzing in the background. As they moved deeper into the city, the ruins of Pripyat loomed before them. Empty buildings, long abandoned streets, and decaying structures that had once been teeming with life. The city felt like a ghost town, but not in the way one might expect. There were no ghosts to be seen, only the lingering presence of those who had once lived here, now lost to time and tragedy. The group of explorers could feel it, an invisible weight pressing down on them, as if the very air itself was charged with a sense of foreboding. The exploration led them closer to the Chernobyl power plant, the heart of the disaster. The plant stood as a dark, looming figure against the pale sky, its steel and concrete frame both imposing and haunting. It was here, in the bowels of this building, that the true horror of Chernobyl had been unleashed. The reactor had exploded, sending a wave of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, contaminating everything in its path. And now, decades later, the area around the plant was still saturated with radiation, some of the most dangerous and deadly in the world. The closer they got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the land itself had absorbed the terror and despair that had come with the disaster. The air tasted metallic, and their Geiger counters began to click more rapidly, signaling the increasing radiation levels. Yet, despite the warning signs, they pressed on. What lay ahead was too important to ignore, too valuable to leave uncovered. Inside the power plant, the scene was even more chilling. The walls, once pristine and carefully maintained, were now covered in a layer of grime, soot, and decay. The signs of the explosion were still visible. The charred, twisted remains of the reactor building, the shattered glass, the broken machinery, all reminders of the catastrophic event that had taken place. It was eerily quiet, save for the faint creaking of metal and the distant echo of footsteps. They felt like intruders in a place that had been abandoned, but not forgotten. As they made their way through the abandoned halls, their footsteps reverberated in the emptiness. The silence was unnatural, almost as if the place itself was holding its breath. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of the disaster, further away from the world they knew. And with every step, the psychological terror began to mount. The radiation, invisible yet ever present, began to take its toll on them. They could feel their heads growing heavy, their bodies aching with each passing minute. The sickness was slow, creeping up on them, but they couldn't turn back. Not now, not when they were so close to the truth. Then, in one of the lower levels of the plant, they found something that should not have been there. A room that had been sealed off for years, its door locked tight, its existence seemingly erased from the plant's records. It was as if the room had been hidden, kept out of sight for a reason. They pried open the door, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. What they found inside would shake them to their core. The room was small and cluttered, but what caught their attention first were the walls. The surfaces were covered in strange symbols, symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint energy, their meaning lost to time. Some of the symbols looked familiar, ancient runes and markings that had been used by cultures long gone, but others were unrecognizable. What had happened in this room? What kind of experiments had been conducted here? And why it had been sealed off, hidden from the world? But that wasn't the most unsettling discovery. In the center of the room, on a table that appeared to have been hastily abandoned, lay an object, an artifact that didn't belong. It was small, metallic, and looked as though it had been designed for something far beyond any conventional use. It hummed faintly, almost as if it was alive, and as the explorers touched it, they felt a strange vibration ripple through their bodies, sending shivers down their spines. None of them could explain it. They could only stand there, transfixed by the object, the weight of its mystery pressing down on them. Was this some kind of experimental device? Was it linked to the disaster that had destroyed this city and its people? Or was it something older, something far more dangerous, tied to the ancient forces that lay buried beneath Pripyat? As they stood in the sealed room, the temperature seemed to drop. Their breath became visible in the cold air. The room felt alive with an energy that they couldn't understand, and the sense of dread grew stronger with every passing second. Something was watching them, something that they couldn't see, but could feel in the pit of their stomachs. It was as if the room had been waiting for them, waiting for the moment when someone would dare to uncover its secrets. But just as they were about to leave, something strange happened. The door, which they had pried open moments ago, slammed shut behind them. The light from their flashlights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. In that silence, in that pitch-black void, they heard something, a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. The voice seemed to come from nowhere, no source, no direction. It was a low, guttural whisper, a voice that chilled them to the bone. Was it the wind? Was it radiation playing tricks on their minds? Or was it something more? They tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in. They were trapped in the room with something they didn't understand. The whispers grew louder, now almost a chorus, and the room began to feel smaller, tighter, suffocating. The object on the table seemed to pulse with energy, as if it was feeding off their fear, feeding off the very presence of their curiosity. Finally, the door swung open. They rushed out, gasping for air, the terror still clinging to them. But the room, the object, the whispers, they stayed with them. And they knew that they had uncovered something they were never meant to find. Something that should have remained hidden. As they made their way back to safety, their minds raced with questions that had no answers. What had they discovered in that sealed room? What was the object, and why had it been hidden away? And most terrifying of all, had they awakened something? Something ancient? Something dangerous? Some places should never be entered. Some doors should remain closed. But the truth, once uncovered, cannot be ignored. And now, Pripyat's dark secrets have been brought to light. The question remains, what else is waiting to be discovered in the heart of the zone? What if the one place everyone avoided was the key to unlocking the entire mystery of Pripyat? What if the city itself holds the final answer? Answers so dark, so unimaginable, that they would shatter everything we thought we knew about the disaster, the Chernobyl explosion, and perhaps even the very fabric of reality itself. The secrets that Pripyat holds are far from ordinary. And the more the explorers uncover, the more they begin to realize this city was never just an abandoned nuclear plant. There is something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous at play. The door was heavy, rusted, its frame warped with age and decay. It had been sealed shut for decades, untouched by time, guarded by the invisible force that had claimed Pripyat. No one had dared to open it. Not the soldiers who were sent to secure the area, not the scientists who ventured into the heart of the exclusion zone, and certainly not the countless explorers who had braved the ruins of the city in search of answers. It had been forgotten, buried beneath layers of dust and secrets. But to the group of explorers standing before it, the door called to them, as if it were the last piece of a puzzle that had been begging to be solved. They had already uncovered much: strange symbols, mysterious markings, objects left behind by those who had once lived here. But this was different. This room, hidden away, unmentioned in any record, was the final frontier. What lay behind it, they believed, held the true story of Pripyat, of Chernobyl, and perhaps of the twisted experiments that had been carried out in secret. It was the one place everyone had avoided, and yet it beckoned them now, like a siren call. With their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness, they pried open the door, its hinges creaking in protest, as though the building itself was trying to keep them out. The room beyond was small, cramped, but it was unlike anything they had ever seen. It wasn't filled with the usual decay of the city, the forgotten toys, the empty classrooms, the rusting playgrounds. Instead, it was unnervingly pristine, almost as if it had been untouched by time. And yet, there was something sinister about it. The air felt heavier here, charged with an unseen force. Inside the room, on the floor, lay a scattering of bizarre artifacts. Strange objects that seemed out of place, geometric shapes that defied logic, small metallic devices, and books whose pages were filled with cryptic diagrams and symbols. At first glance, they appear to be nothing more than discarded objects from forgotten time. But as they examined them more closely, a sense of dread began to settle over the group. These were no ordinary items. There was a purpose behind them, a meaning hidden in the patterns they revealed. Among the items was a small, ornate box, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. When they opened it, a strange hum filled the room, as if the box itself were alive, vibrating with an energy that sent chills down their spines. Inside, the explorers found several documents, yellowed with age, some torn, others carefully preserved. The text was strange, written in a mixture of languages they didn't recognize, interspersed with symbols that seemed to defy interpretation. But as they began to translate the words, a horrifying truth began to emerge. The documents spoke of experiments that had taken place in the heart of Pripyat long before the disaster. These weren't just the typical tests for nuclear power, as the world had been led to believe. The papers hinted at something far more insidious. It became clear that Chernobyl had not only been a site for energy production, but had been the focal point of secret experiments. Experiments involving time manipulation, altered physics, and even mind control. The more they read, the more the room seemed to close in around them, as if the walls themselves were pressing in with the weight of the revelations they had uncovered. They had come to uncover the truth of Pripyat, but what they had found went far beyond anything they had imagined. The documents suggested that the disaster at Chernobyl wasn't just an accident, but the result of these very experiments gone horribly wrong. What if the nuclear explosion was not merely a result of faulty design and human error? What if the true cause was the collapse of an experiment far beyond the scope of conventional understanding? The experiments detailed in the papers seemed to hint at an attempt to manipulate the very fabric of time itself. Some passages described devices that could bend time, alter its flow, while others spoke of the mind's ability to tap into forces beyond its control. The research suggested that the explosion at reactor number 4 had been caused by the disruption of a field of energy, one that had been tampered with to the point where it couldn't be contained any longer. The disaster, in this light, was not just an accident. It was the catastrophic consequence of meddling with forces that were never meant to be understood by human hands. One document, in particular, stood out. It detailed a series of tests that had begun long before the Chernobyl plant was even built. According to the records, the Soviet Union had been experimenting with radiation as a means of controlling time, using the energy produced by nuclear reactions to bend the laws of physics. The tests were shrouded in secrecy, with the highest levels of government involvement. It became clear that Pripyat had been chosen as the site for these experiments, not because of its proximity to the plant, but because of its unique position on the Earth's energy grid, a place where the natural forces of the planet could be manipulated. It was the perfect location for their experiments, hidden away from the world, and yet right at the heart of the Soviet Empire. The more they uncovered, the more the explorers began to question everything they thought they knew about Chernobyl. What if the explosion wasn't just a disaster? It was the inevitable result of the Soviet Union's attempts to control the world's most powerful forces. What if the disaster at Chernobyl was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger plan, one that had been in motion for years? The room grew colder, the air heavier. The explorers could feel the presence of something darker, something ancient, lurking just beyond the edge of their perception. The energy in the room seemed to shift, as though the secrets they had uncovered were not meant to be exposed. They could hear faint whispers, distant murmurs, as if the very walls of the room were speaking to them, warning them to leave before it was too late. As they examined the artifacts and documents further, they stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the floor, one that had been sealed shut for years. Inside, they found a metal case locked with an old, intricate mechanism. Their hands trembled as they opened it, unsure of what they would find. Inside the case was a strange device, an object that resembled an old clock, but with gears and dials that defied logic. It was covered in the same cryptic symbols they had seen in the documents. But there was something else about it, something unsettling. The device seemed to hum with an energy of its own, as though it was still active, still capable of doing whatever it was designed to do. The explorers knew they had to leave, but they could not bring themselves to leave the room. The device pulsed with an eerie glow, and the whispers in the air grew louder, more urgent. Something was wrong, something that had been disturbed, something that should have remained hidden. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The air became thick, suffocating, and the device in the case began to hum louder, its pulse growing faster, as if it were waking from a long slumber. In the pitch-black room, the explorers could hear their own breathing, but nothing else. The silence was deafening. They fumbled for their flashlights, but the darkness swallowed them whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the light returned, but the room was no longer the same. The device had vanished. Everything was in place, except for the device. It was gone, as though it had never been there at all. Panic set in. The group stumbled back, unsure of what they had just experienced. Was it the radiation playing tricks on their minds? Had they uncovered something far worse than they had imagined? The device had been real. They had all seen it. And yet, now it was gone, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in its wake. They fled the room, leaving behind the mystery that had so unnerved them. But as they made their way out of the plant, one question echoed in their minds. What had they awakened? And more terrifyingly, what had been sealed away for so long? The heart of Pripyat had held a secret far darker than they had ever imagined. And the truth, it seemed, was still waiting just out of reach. Some things cannot be undone. Some places are destined to remain forbidden, frozen in time, and haunted by their past. But the truth is, the story of Pripyat isn't over. In fact, the true horrors of this place, its secrets, are far from being fully uncovered. What happened in Chernobyl was not just a disaster. It was the beginning of something else, something far darker and far more enduring than anyone could have predicted. Pripyat stands still, trapped in a moment it can never escape. The city, abandoned by its people, has become a frozen relic, a place locked in time. But what if this timelessness is not an accident? What if, in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster, the very fabric of reality itself was altered? The radiation that poisoned the land, the air, and the water, what if it didn't just destroy life? What if it changed time itself? In the years following the disaster, Pripyat became a place of legend. Its eerie stillness, its decaying buildings, and the toxic remnants of the nuclear catastrophe drew explorers, scientists, and curious wanderers who sought to unravel the truth. They came, they saw, and some of them never returned. Others came back with stories, strange experiences, and inexplicable encounters that defied all logic. But as the years turned into decades, the lingering question remained. Was Pripyat really abandoned? Or was it trapped, caught in a loop that could never be undone? The truth, as it turns out, is even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The radiation that poured out from reactor number 4 didn't just contaminate the land. It didn't just cause sickness and death. It warped reality itself. Some theorists, those who had studied the phenomenon of radioactive anomalies and time distortion, began to speculate that the explosion at Chernobyl had not only disrupted the fabric of the physical world, but had also bent the laws of time. The more they delved into the zone, the more they began to see patterns, disturbing, strange patterns. The same location, visited at different times, would sometimes show up as if it were untouched by the years. The same objects, the same street corners, the same buildings. They seemed to remain in a state of perpetual stagnation, as if time itself was reluctant to move forward. Some believed it was simply the result of radiation-induced damage. Others, however, whispered about something far more sinister. They spoke of time loops, of Pripyat being caught in a continuous, never-ending cycle. Was it possible that the disaster had somehow reset the clock, trapping the city in an eternal moment? As explorers ventured deeper into the heart of the zone, they began to notice the subtle signs. People who returned to the city years after their first visit reported strange sensations, as if they were experiencing a moment they had lived before. Photographs of the same street taken months apart showed no change, no signs of decay, no progress in the natural world. Buildings appeared untouched by the elements, while the nearby forest seemed frozen in an unnatural state. Some explorers even reported hearing voices or seeing figures in the distance, figures that would vanish when they got too close. Were these echoes of the past? Or was something in the very air of Pripyat preventing time from moving forward? The idea of time manipulation, of a city trapped in a loop, began to gain traction among certain circles. Some said that the Chernobyl disaster had triggered a chain reaction, a disruption in the very flow of time that prevented Pripyat from moving forward. Radiation, they claimed, had affected not just the human body, but the very molecules of existence, warping the timeline itself. In the aftermath of the explosion, time in Pripyat had been torn open, leaving the city locked in an eternal stasis. The people who had once lived there, those who had fled in the wake of the disaster, were now part of the city's curse, their memories and lives forever bound to the place they had left behind. As the years passed, more and more unexplained phenomena began to emerge. The government, having long since abandoned its efforts to keep Pripyat under wraps, turned a blind eye to the increasing number of reports. Yet, there were those scientists, independent researchers, even former workers from the Chernobyl plant, who could not ignore the mounting evidence. It wasn't just the physical anomalies, it was the emotional and psychological toll. The survivors of the disaster, those who had witnessed the horror firsthand, spoke of strange dreams and recurring visions. Visions of Pripyat, of the streets they had once walked, of the places they had once lived, as though they were still there, still present. They would wake up in the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, just out of sight. They could hear the echoes of footsteps, voices calling out from the distance, and sometimes even laughter. But when they turned around, there was nothing there. The deeper these researchers dug, the more disturbing the truth became. The very ground of Pripyat had absorbed the trauma of the disaster, but it had also absorbed something else, a strange energy, a force that prevented the passage of time. The reactor, with its immense power and energy, had created an opening, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. In the aftermath, Pripyat became a nexus point, a place where time was no longer linear, where past, present, and future collided. The disaster at Chernobyl had not just been an accident, it had been a catalyst, opening a doorway to something far beyond human understanding. The idea that Pripyat was now trapped in a time loop raised terrifying questions. What would happen if the loop couldn't be broken? What if the city could never move forward, never progress? Was the disaster itself a reflection of something older, something deeper, hidden beneath the city's foundations? Could it be that Pripyat was built on top of an ancient, forgotten site? one that had once been the center of strange and forbidden rituals? Had the nuclear explosion simply been the final catalyst, awakening something ancient and powerful? For those who had lived through the disaster, the emotional toll was immense. They had lost their homes, their families, their lives. They had been forced to leave behind everything they had known, to flee a place that had once been full of promise and hope. But even in exile, they could not escape the pull of Pripyat. Some returned to the zone, unable to shake the feeling that they had been left with unfinished business. They sought closure, answers to questions that had haunted them for years. But no matter how much they searched, no matter how much they dug into the past, they could not escape the haunting reality of the place. It was as if Pripyat had claimed them, trapped them in its endless cycle, forcing them to relive the tragedy over and over again. And the worst part was this: no matter how many times the survivors returned, no matter how many times they ventured into the heart of the zone, they could never truly leave. It was as if they were bound to the city, trapped in its endless loop, forever haunted by the disaster and the lives that had been lost. As the researchers pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle, one chilling realization became clear. Pripyat was not just a place abandoned by its people. It was a place that had become a prison, a trap for those who had once lived there and for anyone who dared to uncover its secrets. And the radiation, the force that had caused the disaster, had not just altered the land and its people. It had altered time itself, creating a fracture in reality that would never heal. The question lingered in the air. Could the loop ever be broken? Was there a way to free Pripyat from its endless cycle? Or was the city doomed to remain frozen in time forever? And then, in the final moments, as the explorers prepared to leave the zone, one of them made a discovery. A relic. It was a small, forgotten item, buried beneath layers of rubble, untouched by the passage of time. It was a photograph, a portrait of a family that had lived in Pripyat before the disaster. But what was most disturbing about the photograph was the date, inscribed on the back in faded ink. It was a date from the future. The future. The discovery sent chills through the group. Was Pripyat's time loop already stretching into a future that had not yet come to pass? Had the city's curse already begun to affect the world beyond? Some things, it seems, can never be undone, and some places are destined to remain trapped, forever frozen in time. And perhaps, just perhaps, the story of Pripyat hasn't ended yet. What lies beyond the edge of the loop? What has been left behind in the dark corners of the zone? The truth is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And it's a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. Pripyat remains, frozen in time, haunted by the echoes of its past and the secrets buried beneath its crumbling streets. The radiation that shattered lives, the experiments that twisted reality itself, and the lingering, unfinished stories. All of it melds into a chilling reality that refuses to let go. As you stand on the edge of the zone, the question lingers in the air. What is the true legacy of Pripyat? What truths still remain locked away, waiting for the brave enough to uncover them? As the city of ghosts keeps its secrets close, so too do we hold the key to unlocking more stories from places long forgotten. But the mystery doesn't end here. In fact, it's only just beginning. There are countless untold tales, hidden worlds, and forgotten histories waiting to be discovered. So, if you felt the pull of these dark, untold stories, if the haunting whispers of Pripyat still echo in your mind, then make sure you don't miss the next chapter. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we venture deeper into the unknown. Like, comment, and share this journey with those who dare to know what lies beyond the veil of time. Because some mysteries, some untold tales, are worth following to the very end. Will you stay with us and continue to uncover the truth? The door is open. Step into the darkness with us and let the story unfold. Subscribe now. The next mystery awaits.